What the United States government did was shameful. And I am sorry.
We have no idea how many wives, girlfriends, children inherited the disease and also died or were forever crippled by its effects.
For 40 years, the U.S. government-operated public health service conducted what was known as the Tuskegee Syphilis Study, one of the darkest chapters in American history.
It's amazing what you can find if you took the time to look. And you don't even have to be a rocket scientist to find these things out. You just have to have a desire to find it and a willingness to go and find it. And it's so cool that you don't even have to leave your house to find this information out. You could just turn on your computer or your tablet, iPad and find it, research it and find it. There was a time that we didn't have the internet and electronic devices, and you had to actually get up and go to a physical brick and mortar library and research and look for information. So it's really no excuse for anyone to be willfully ignorant. Last few months, I've been doing a lot of research and looking for things, particularly about American slavery that people don't really talk about, but the information is out there. And I stumbled across articles about slaves and medical experiments. What's amazing to me is how people still want to grumble, fight, and complain when it comes to reparations to the offsprings of slaves in this country. When this doggone foundation and damn near every sector in this country was built off of the backs of slaves. Slaves were most likely the guinea pig. Without further ado, let me get on with this sad article. Sad truth. When the Constitution banned the international African slave trade, there became an issue with how the U.S. was going to maintain and grow this very lucrative system of slavery. The solution was to concentrate on natural increases, which simply meant making sure that enslaved women had children who lived past the age of 1, because slavery was a condition that was passed to the child from the mother. What this did was lay at the feet of black women an added responsibility to have more children. In addition, because modern gynecology advanced quite rapidly in the South, these doctors, many of whom were slave owners themselves, had access to black bodies, particularly black women's bodies, to experiment on, to examine, and to, in their words, cure or fix diseases and disorders. I coined the term medical superbodies because black women stood at this crossroads of being a universal norm for healing, because clearly these doctors could use these women to cure any women, and yet their bodies still held these radicalized fictions. For instance, that black women were more hypersexual or lascivious, black women don't experience pain, black women are immodest. All of those things tie into this belief that somehow black women were intellectually inferior to white women, but also physically stronger, without any linkage being made to the fact that most black women were agricultural slaves. The history of human experimentation is as old as the practice of medicine, and in the modern era has always targeted disadvantaged, marginalized, institutionalized, stigmatized, and vulnerable populations: prisoners, the condemned, orphans, the mentally ill, students, the poor, women, the disabled, children, peoples of color, indigenous peoples, and the enslaved. Human subject research is evident wherever physicians, technicians, pharmaceutical companies, and others are trialing new practices and implementing the latest diagnostic and therapeutic agents and procedures. In the American South in the days of slavery was no different. And for those looking for easy targets, black slave bodies were easy to come by. There is a rich and rapidly expanding scholarly literature examining the history of human subject research, including studies of the burgeoning biomedical economy in the U.S. in the 20th century. The Tuskegee experiment and other episodes of medical racism all feature prominently. The history of the acquisition and exploitation of slave bodies for medical education and research in the U.S. first explored in depth by historians James Breeden and Todd Savick, focused primarily on medical schools and the traffic of slave bodies in Virginia. Savick's work drew attention to professional medicine's use of slaves in classroom and bedside demonstrations in operating amphitheaters and experimental facilities. Savick argued that African Americans were easy targets for ambitious and entrepreneurial white physicians in the slave South. Slaves as human commodities were readily transformed into a medical resource easily accessible as empirical test subjects through the combined power and authority of the enslaver and their employee, the white physician. Savick suggested that outright experimentation upon living humans may have occurred more openly and perhaps more often owing to the nature of slave society, and also that the situation may have been and probably was worse in the Deep South. Surprise, surprise. It's almost like the Deep South had its own, well, still had and has its own set of rules. When an elite white enslaver physician, Charlestonian Elise S. Bennett, published notes recalling the case of a truly extraordinary tumor afflicting a young female slave on the family's James Island plantation. His narrative revealed much about the opportunities for human subject research under American slavery. Bennett recalled an unnamed female patient subject who had developed a small tumor the size of a 10-cent piece behind her right ear when she was just 4 weeks old. In 1817, when Bennett was training to become a doctor and anxious to perform an operation, he, together with a fellow physician apprentice, made a disastrously cruel surgical attempt to explore and remove this growth. In an era prior to anesthesia and asepsis, this type of surgical intervention was extremely dangerous, especially when undertaken by two unsupervised apprentices who took liberty of an opportunity presented by an extremely vulnerable enslaved child. As Bennett remembered, the child suffered a great deal of inflammation as a result, and only by very close attention did she recover in 6 to 8 weeks. The plantation labor camp's seclusion providing perfect cover for what would prove to be a major medical blunder. As I've said in previous videos, a slave had about as much rights as an animal, and then animals had more rights than them. And if you look at things closely today, in the 21st century, black folks are still considered treated that way and seem to have less rights and consideration than an animal. Some might beg to differ, some might try to argue me down, but the proof is in the pudding. Let's continue. Bennett's cruel interference with the tumor, which may have been in a lymph node, was the cause of a severe inflammatory reaction and sudden excessive growth of a lesion. In 1821, when the child was 6, Bennett described the tumor as being the size of an ostrich egg. While in the years immediately prior to her death, his narrative reported that the tumor increased to an enormous, indeed extraordinary size. The case report concludes with a postmodern analysis, or as Bennett noted in a ghoulish tone, an imperfect outline of the results furnished by the examination of the tumor. When I obtained the head, or at least so much of it as remained. The remains of the enslaved girl's skull became a pathological specimen in the University of Maryland's Medical Museum collection. All of the key training networks and power bases of Southern medicine, apprenticeships, private practice, colleges, hospital journals, and societies operated through slavery's ruthless traffic and exploitation of black bodies. White medical students, as a matter of course, expected education and training based on the observation, dissection, and experimental treatment of black bodies. White doctors, including those in remote rural locations, routinely sent reports of experiments on slave subjects to medical journals and trafficked black bodies to medical colleges. Medical museums openly solicited black body parts, and medical societies relied on black bodies. Students too wrote graduating theses based on the medical manipulation of black subjects and specimens. Invasive surgeries and other shocking experiments were commonplace on slaves before the Civil War, according to a sweeping new survey of old medical journals. Electric shocks, brain surgery, amputation, these are just some of the medical experiments widely performed on American slaves in the mid-1800s, according to a new survey of medical journals published before the Civil War. Previous work by historians had uncovered a handful of rogue physicians conducting medical experiments on slaves, but the new report published in the latest issue of the journal The Endeavor suggests that a widespread network of medical colleges and doctors across the American South carried out and published slave experiments for decades. The physicians and colleges saw an opportunity in the institution of slavery to elevate themselves, and they took it. Historian Stephen Kenny of the University of Liverpool in the UK, who wrote the report, told BuzzFeed News it was commonplace. Medical journals that no longer exist, such as So the next time someone want to come in and foolishly, ignorantly, stupidly say black people didn't contribute to this country, you kindly remind them that the advancement of the medical sector heavily relied on experiments on bodies that look like ours. In other words, tell them put a sock in it. The study details 4 surgical experiments in particular, dating from 1833 to 1858, that doctors performed on slaves. One, for example, involved severing healthy-looking brains from a slave with a head injury, killing him. Another removed a tumor from an unnamed young girl's lymph node, which likely made it swell grotesquely around her head. Did you hear that? if a slave had a head injury that wasn't severe, that could have led to death, if the head injury, if he just had a simple head injury, they would just let him die so that they can examine his healthy looking brain. Did you hear that? And then now you get a clearer picture. More when I run across these stories and do this amazing research, I see clearly why they want to get rid of talking about slavery. It's too deplorable. When people call themselves superior and, everyone else under them, mainly black Americans, are inferior, they don't want it to be known just how savage they are, because when you're superior, you're not savage. But superior people wouldn't conduct themselves in the way that they have conducted themselves. You wouldn't have to be brutal and barbaric. If you were superior, you'd be highly intelligent and probably have some kind of compassion. Barbaric, cruel people are the ones who don't have compassion. The physician and slave owner William Aiken of Winnsboro, North Carolina, reported an 1852 experiment on a slave named Lucinda, who suffered from a bony growth around her right eye. Aiken and other doctors disfigured her by boring holes in her head without chloroform, a gas that was used at the time for anesthesia to remove the growth. These cases were reported. Could you imagine what this woman was going through? To perform that kind of surgery on someone and you don't give them any kind of pain medication, I obviously had to see them as not human. You have to lack some kind of, you have to not have compassion and see this person as nothing to do surgery on them without any kind of pain medication. These cases were reported in respected medical periodicals read from Europe to the Western frontier. Medicine is an integral part of the story of slavery. Todd Sevick, a medical historian at the Brody School of Medicine at East Carolina University, told BuzzFeed News. Sevick first reported in the 1970s that medical schools in Virginia had trafficked in slaves prior to the Civil War, but historians had seen medical experiments on slaves as a practice isolated to a few physicians until now. In the summer of 1989, construction workers unearthed 10,000 bones from a basement belonging to the Medical College of Georgia in Augusta. Many of the bones show signs of dissection. Forensic investigators quickly discovered they were the legacy of 5 decades of grave robbing intended to provide medical students before and after the Civil War with cadavers for anatomical lessons. This practice didn't end until early 20th century. That medical college and others like it grew in the shadow of slavery, Kenny said. The professionalism of medicine in the decades before the Civil War, physicians needed to learn anatomy, and slaves provided a supply of bodies, he said. The price of slaves increased precipitously in 1807 after the halt of the British slave trade that made medical treatment to heal injured, diseased slaves an industry, Kenny said, and helped create a demand for experiments. Slave hospitals sprang up around trading centers such as Augusta, New Orleans, and Charleston, South Carolina, to doctor sick slaves intended for sale and to heal valuable workers. The South Carolina physician J. Marion Sims, often referred to as the father of gynecology, developed a surgery for complications of childbirth on slave women in the 1840s. Long seen as a villain, more recent historical research has suggested that some women willingly participated in Sims surgeries, making him a more ambiguous figure. Many surgical techniques, including amputations and experiments using ether as anesthesia, were tested on slaves before they made their way into standard medicine. The old studies did not mention whether the slaves consented to the experiments and physical restraints were common. Some reports describe slaves bolting from the room when subjected to electrical shocks or scalpels without pain relief. A woman named Harriet, who was suffering from seizures, was electrically shocked in an 1848 experiment for 53 minutes, for example, even though it required 3 doctors to restrain her. Doctors interpreted her protests about her back being burned as a sign of electrotherapy's efficacy, according to the study, and recommended it for everyone suffering nervous disorders. Under the skin, they knew on some level that people were the same. So they used slaves in medicine, Savick said. They knew that, but still saw slaves as different from other people. I struggle with the question every time I'm asked to explain it. Although historians are only beginning to explore widespread experimentation on slaves and grave robbing, Kinney added, the findings won't surprise black communities near the sites of medical hospitals. Folklore of night doctors who robbed graves or black bottle men who poisoned patients to dissect them is more than a century old, he said, and likely springs from the era of these cruel experiments. When the practice of hands-on anatomical dissection became popular in the United States, medical education in the late 18th and early 19th centuries demanded for cadavers exceeded the supply. Slave bodies and deaths by grave robbers met this demand. Members of the public were aware that graves were being robbed and countered with various protective measures. Since the deterrence of grave robbing took time and money, those elements of society who were least economically and socially disadvantaged were the most vulnerable. Enslaved and free African Americans, immigrants, and the poor were frequently the target of grave robbing. The politically powerful tolerated this behavior except when it affected their own burial sites. You see what I mean? I said in another video that I think it was the video I just did on the Kerner report, the report that came out in the 60s that indicted white America being responsible for the frustrations of black America. But anyway, I said that instead of people getting angry and condemning and judging black folks, you need to take that to the politicians that have the power to change things for the better, particularly when it comes to the oppression, disenfranchisement, racism and biasness and prejudiceness and disenfranchisement intentionally done to the black community. There are people in positions that have insurmountable power to change this, and they don't, and they won't. They're either going to do it willingly or it's going to be forced. But my point is, just as they said that the politically powerful did nothing to stop grave robbing when it was targeting black Americans and other poor citizens, they only intervened when it was affecting their burial sites. Slave owners sold the bodies of their deceased chattel to medical schools for anatomic dissection. Stories of the night doctors buying and stealing bodies became part of African American folklore tradition. The physical and documentary evidence demonstrates the disproportionate use of the bodies of the poor, the black, and the marginalized, and furthering the medical education of white elites. I don't know if you noticed, I didn't have too much to say. I was really short on the commentary during this, on my personal commentaries, exclamations and vocal outrages during this video, because I was actually I was speechless, and I wasn't surprised at all, because I've been saying since I started doing these videos, basically putting on blast the horrific history of Black Americans in this country, I have said numerous times that I believe there are things that were done to slaves and Black Americans after slavery that's so horrific they want to keep it hidden. But what is hidden always comes out. A lot of people want to shun the Bible and mock the Bible, but if you look at the scripture where it says the truth always comes out and it's going to be shouted from the rooftop, basically you can't hide anything, secret sins, none of that. You can't hide it because it always comes out. It comes out. And that's what this country has been trying to do during slavery and after slavery, always trying to hide things. As a child, we learned that when we try to hide things, it's not right. And you know better. When you're a child and you do something and you're trying to hide it from your parent or guardian, that lets the parent or the guardian know that you know better. So when grown men and women try to hide their indiscretions, they know it's wrong. You wouldn't have if you didn't believe it was wrong, you wouldn't have to hide it. If they believe that what they did to Black Americans during slavery and after slavery and now, if they believe that it wasn't wrong, they wouldn't hide it. So that's evidence right there. And as I said, the damning things that were done to Black Americans during slavery, after slavery, and now is astronomical. It's there's no price tag. But even though it's not a price tag, that don't mean you can't repair it financially. And that Black people shouldn't pay taxes ever again in life for anything. Federal taxes are taxes on commodities, on properties, on groceries, cars. We shouldn't pay taxes on anything. Every cent of debt that any Black American owe should be wiped off. That's a part of reparations. That's a part of repairing hundreds of years of damages. You got to start somewhere. And like I said, either it's going to be willingly done or it's going to be forced. It's going to be made to be done. And if I was a white American and I know the true history of what this country did to Black Americans and their offspring, I would be like, look, to the powers that be, y'all need to get this right. Because I personally believe this country is going to get worse and worse until they actively, sincerely, with a contrite heart, repair the damages that were intentionally inflicted upon our ancestors and continued after physical chains were removed. All right, that's the end. Thanks again for your support. Those who have subscribed, those who have shared these videos. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. And I will be back with another installment to my collection or playlist of videos talking about the vileness or putting on blast the vileness of slavery and repercussions after slavery. Okay, be safe. Thank you.